You're tuned into Collateral Damage, the military families FAP and IDC leave behind. Voices have been altered, because in this system, honesty has a price. Let's jump into Episode 8. Labeled an offender without evidence? It's happening even to civilians.
We often think of the military, as this system that's all about precision, fairness. But what happens when parts of that system might feel, well, maybe a bit unbalanced?
Yeah, that's what we've been digging into. Specifically, this Incident Determination Committee, the IDC, it's part of the military's Family Advocacy Program.
And what we're finding, it really raises some serious questions about how service members, maybe even their civilian partners, spouses, how they can end up labeled as an offender in a big Department of Defense database.
Exactly. So our mission today, really, is to unpack this whole IDC process.
Right.
We want to get into how it works, look at the big concerns people have about fairness, about due process, and just make clear what the real-world fallout can be for the people caught up in it. Think of this as like your quick guide to getting fully informed on something that could genuinely change someone's life.
And we're drawing this from?
We've looked at official documents, legal analyses, and also, importantly, discussions from people who've actually experienced this system, covering roughly 2018 right up to the end of March this year.
Okay, so let's just start at the beginning. What exactly is the IDC supposed to do?
Well, basically, the IDC is the military group that reviews reports of domestic abuse or child abuse.
Okay.
Their main job is to decide if an incident actually meets the DoD's definition of abuse. And crucially, they're the ones who decide, okay, does this person get labeled an offender?
That label goes somewhere specific.
Yeah, it gets recorded in this DOG database. It's used for tracking incidents and also for putting together reports for Congress, that sort of thing.
Right. And who actually sits on this committee? Who makes these calls?
It's a confidential meeting, very closed door. An administrative thing, really. The installation commander chairs it.
Okay.
And the voting members. You've got the soldier zone commander.
Interesting.
Representatives from military police or investigators. Someone from the Staff Judge Advocate's office, that's the legal side, and folks from the Family Advocacy Program, FAP itself.
And they're measuring these incidents against what exactly? Is there a clear standard?
Yeah, they use the official DoD definitions, what counts as abuse.
Yeah.
You can actually find these definitions publicly, like on sites such as womenslaw.org.
Okay.
So if the committee decides, yep, this meets the criteria, the incident report goes into what the Army calls its central registry first, and then that info gets fed into the bigger DoD-wide database. That's how the Army regulations lay it out.
Now, this is where it gets, well, a bit concerning. Someone described the way information gets to the IDC as being like that kid's game telephone. What's the thinking there?
That's actually a really good way to put it. Think about it. Often, the story starts with a social worker talking to the people involved.
Right, first-hand account.
But that social worker doesn't usually talk directly to the IDC. Instead, they typically report up to their supervisor. And then the supervisor is the one who relays the information to the committee members.
So, like, in the game, the message could change along the way.
That's the fear, yeah. Just like in telephone, there's a real risk that the original details get distorted, maybe simplified, or key context gets lost as it passes through those layers.
And I guess that's made worse by the fact that the person being discussed, they're not usually part of this process.
Exactly. That's a huge criticism, the lack of what most people would consider basic due process.
Meaning
the individuals involved often have no idea what specific details are being shared about them in that closed IDC meeting. And maybe even more critical, they typically don't get to be there. They don't get a chance to present their side of the story or, challenge anything that's being said about them.
Okay, wow. So let's dive deeper into these criticisms then. Because being labeled an offender based on information that might be incomplete or even wrong, that sounds incredibly serious. What are the main worries?
Well, one of the biggest ones is definitely the potential for false accusations. The idea that someone could be labeled based on claims that aren't backed up by solid, credible evidence.
And the consequences aren't minor.
Not at all. We looked at analysis from King Military Law. They specialize in these military cases, and they stress just how severe the career impacts can be.
Like what?
Things like having your security clearance suspended, being temporarily pulled from your duties, having promotions put on hold. It can even trigger proceedings to separate someone from the military entirely.
That is, yeah, that's a massive amount hanging in the balance. And this isn't just theoretical, right? People have challenged these decisions.
Oh, yeah. Keen military law specifically mentions cases where they've successfully appealed IDC findings because they argued the original decision was based on false allegations. So it absolutely shows that mistakes can, and apparently do, happen in this system.
Okay, another thing that jumps out is having the person's commander on the committee, the installation commander, their direct CO. Doesn't that create a potential conflict of interest or maybe a perception of bias?
That's a very common concern, definitely. Having both the service member's immediate boss and the senior base commander as voting members, it naturally raises questions about impartiality. Well, a commander's primary job is discipline, unit readiness. They might already have opinions about the soldier, or maybe feel pressure for a certain outcome, for the good of the unit or whatever.
Right.
And this isn't just a theoretical concern either. You see it reflected in discussions online, like on Reddit, in the RUSNC forum, talking about the Family Advocacy Program. People have straight up called the IDC a kangaroo court.
Wow, kangaroo court.
Yes.
That's strong language. It really suggests a deep distrust in the fairness of it.
It does. It points to a feeling that maybe the commanders involved already have their minds made up, or that the process isn't really about finding the truth impartially.
Now, you also mentioned earlier that how people are even told about these decisions isn't consistent. What's the issue there?
Right. The Government Accountability Office, the GAO, looked into this, and they found pretty significant differences across the services. Like, the Navy and Marine Corps generally follow their rules, which say notifications should be in writing. But the GAO found the Army and Air Force were less consistent. Sometimes notifications were just verbal.
Just verbal for something this serious.
Apparently so. And the GAO pointed out that this lack of a standard written notification can easily cause confusion, especially since often the notifications themselves, written or verbal, weren't very clear about why the decision was made or what the full implications really were.
So you could potentially be flagged as an offender in the system and not even fully grasp the basis for it or what it means for you down the line. That seems incredibly problematic.
It really does.
Okay, let's shift then to the database itself. Once someone's name is in that DoD database, what are the big concerns about that?
One of the most worrying things, and something the GAO highlighted, is how this information might be misused later on, in legal battles specifically. Remember, the IDC is an administrative process, right? And the database is mainly for tracking trends, reporting numbers to Congress. It's not supposed to be a formal legal finding of guilt.
Okay.
But the GAO found examples where these IDC decisions, these administrative findings, were actually brought up as evidence in civilian court cases, like child custody disputes or divorces.
Whoa, so an administrative finding could influence a judge's decision in a completely separate legal arena.
That's the risk, because the standard of proof, the rules of evidence, the due process, it's all very different between an IDC meeting and a courtroom. So using an IDC finding in court could unfairly tip the scales in really critical family law cases. It's an unintended consequence, the GAO says, but a really significant one.
Yeah, that sounds like a major flaw. What about the career impact? We talked about King military law saying it's severe. Is that the consensus?
Well, that's another tricky area. There actually seems to be some disagreement, or at least different takes, on just how bad the career damage is. So yes, King military law paints a pretty grim picture of serious negative effects. But then another firm, Daniel Conway and Associates, suggests that, well, maybe an IDC finding like this won't necessarily kill your career, unless, perhaps, it restricts you from jobs working with children on base.
So, conflicting signals.
Exactly. But here's another layer that came up in the sources, and it's particularly concerning for civilian spouses or partners.
What's that?
Even if the service member's military career somehow weathers the storm, there's this worry that outside agencies, employers, background check companies could potentially get access to this DoD database.
Oh, wow.
So if a civilian spouse or partner gets labeled an offender through this FAP process, maybe without ever knowing the full accusations or seeing the evidence, it could suddenly pop up and hurt their civilian job prospects, their background checks.
Without them even knowing they were formally accused or listed.
That's the fear expressed. So this conflating info on career impact, combined with the potential civilian spillover, it really just highlights the sheer unpredictability of the consequences. You get this label, and you might have no clear idea what it will actually mean for your future or your family's future. And that uncertainty itself is a huge burden.
That is genuinely disturbing. The idea that someone outside the military structure could face professional harm from this, maybe totally blindsided. Okay, so if someone does feel they've been wrongly labeled, what can they do? Can they fight it?
Yes, appealing an IDC decision is possible. King Military Law's success stories show that.
There's always a but, isn't there?
Yeah, the but is that the appeal process is widely described as being really challenging. And often you absolutely need a lawyer to navigate it effectively.
Which costs money.
Right. And that creates a pretty big hurdle for service members or families who just don't have the resources to hire legal help. So yeah, the appeal option exists on paper, but in practice, it might not be a realistic path for everyone who feels wronged.
So it's not just the IDC meeting itself, but other factors around it can cause problems too. You mentioned something about gatekeeping earlier within the Family Advocacy Program.
Yes, that was an interesting point from some firsthand accounts. It seems FAP directors themselves might sometimes decide not to even send a report to the IDC.
Why would they do that?
If they personally decide the incident doesn't meet the official criteria for abuse, they might just stop it there. There was one really concerning story shared online where someone reported what sounded like a serious threat, but the FAP director apparently decided it wasn't technically child abuse, so the IDC never even reviewed it.
So a potentially serious situation gets blocked before the committee even sees it.
That's what the account suggested. It raises questions about whether potentially dangerous situations are consistently getting the review they need, or if it sometimes depends on one person's interpretation at the initial stage.
It really sounds like there are multiple places in this whole chain where things could go sideways, or where subjective judgment plays a huge role. How does this military approach stack up against how, say, civilian authorities handle similar abuse allegations?
That's a really important comparison to make. In the civilian world, if there are allegations of domestic or child abuse, you typically have police investigations, maybe criminal charges, and formal court proceedings.
Right, with judges, lawyers, evidence rules.
Exactly. Those civilian systems are built with significant due process protections baked in. The right to have a lawyer, the chance to present your own evidence, the right to cross-examine accusers or witnesses. The IDC, being an administrative process run internally with command heavily involved, it just fundamentally doesn't have those same kinds of judicial safeguards.
And that difference is probably why you hear terms like kangaroo court.
Very likely.
Yeah.
That inherent lack of formal judicial process is almost certainly a major reason why the IDC is perceived by some as potentially unfair.
And it's not always about clear-cut severe abuse cases either, is it? You found a really surprising story on Reddit about finances.
Yeah, that one was kind of startling. Someone posted describing how they got labeled an offender in what sounds like a domestic dispute, but it seemed to boil down to them managing the household finances because, they claimed, their partner was irresponsible with money and wasn't paying bills.
So managing money became an offense.
The implication from the poster was that because the supposedly irresponsible partner didn't have totally free access to all the money, it was somehow twisted into meeting the criteria for an offense within the FAP system. It really makes you wonder how broadly and maybe sometimes inappropriately that offender label might be getting applied.
Okay, so pulling all this together, all these concerns, these potential traps, what are the big takeaways for people listening? What needs to change here?
Well, it seems pretty clear that some significant reforms are needed. Things like finding ways to bring in more independent review, maybe people from outside the direct chain of command to boost impartiality.
Makes sense.
Definitely standardizing the notification process.
Yeah.
Everyone should get clear, detailed written notice about the decision and its implications. No more just verbal stuff.
Right.
And making the appeal process more transparent, maybe easier to access, even for people without lawyers. Those seem like critical steps.
What about the GAO recommendation? They suggested the DOD needs to fix things.
Yeah, the GAO recommended the DOD clarify its guidance on all this by, I think it was December 30th, 2027. So that's a deadline out there. But, just changing guidance isn't enough.
Yeah.
There needs to be real follow-up and monitoring to see if those changes actually fix the underlying problems on the ground.
And the database itself, the place where the offender label lives, some of the sources had pretty strong feelings about that.
They really did.
Yeah.
I mean, when you consider the potentially massive, life-changing consequences that can flow from this administrative process, and you combine that with the fact that, as we've discussed, there's no guarantee of full due process.
Yeah.
People might not know the details, might not have a lawyer. Well, the concluding thought in one source was pretty stark.
Which was?
It basically suggested that maybe the only truly sensible thing to do, given the current lack of guaranteed due process, is to just get rid of that DOD offender database altogether. at least until they can build a system where fairness and proper legal safeguards are truly baked in.
Wow, just delete the database. That's a powerful statement about the level of concern. So, for you listening to this, what's the bottom line from our deep dive today? It really seems like we've peeled back the layers on a military system, the IDC, the DoD database that's incredibly complex.
Yeah.
And carries the potential for really profound impacts on service members, on their families, often in ways that could easily be seen as unfair, even unjust.
Absolutely. The key things to take away are just how intricate this system is, the very real and significant criticisms about its fairness and lack of due process, and the potential for truly life-altering outcomes for anyone labeled an offender.
And it leaves us with a pretty big question, doesn't it?
It really does. Given that this administrative process can have such huge consequences, what are the ethical responsibilities of the military here? How do they ensure accuracy, fairness, and proper due process for everyone involved in these incredibly sensitive situations?
Something definitely worth thinking about. We hope this deep dive has given you a clearer picture of the issues involved.
Yeah, we encourage you to think about the different viewpoints we covered and maybe check out some of the resources mentioned, like womenslaw.org or the GAO reports if you want to understand even more.